Hello, one and all, Jake here. And believe it or not, this is a Nintendo 64 controller. Yeah, that's right. So there's been a lot of bad things said about this controller over the years, and some of it's valid, some of it I think is a little bit unfair. But if there's one thing that I can agree is a major problem with this controller, it's this thing. No, I'm not talking about the fact that there's an analog stick here. I just mean the construction of the analog stick. Like, look how loose this is. Um, I hold this up to the camera and like tilt it a little bit. You can see that the stick is like wobbling in place. It's really loose. You turn a little, you return to neutral, and there's no telling exactly where it's going to be. And then an effect of this looseness is that it requires more and more resistance to actually get an actual input into the controller. You're going to be giving so much resistance to the stick that the tendons in your hand will start to hurt. And at least that's what's happening to me. And, I use my hands for a lot of things, so I don't want that to happen. So it would be nice if this stick were just a bit better. Now, what do I have here? Oh, look, a GameCube controller. Now, the thing about the GameCube controller that I'm going to mention here, one generation later, look, I flick the controller, it goes back to neutral, and it also isn't as resistive as the Nintendo 64 analog stick. This is a perfectly fine analog stick. Now, you probably won't need me to tell you this, but just in case you do, here's an Xbox One controller. Completely different company that makes it, but as you can see, the analog stick has light resistance and snaps back into place. If I move the controller, it does not wobble at all. You could use this thing for years and would continue to snap back to this neutral position. So yeah, since the Nintendo 64 days, the analog stick has been greatly improved. Now, if you wanted a more ideal gameplay experience, could you take a modern controller and just plug it into a Nintendo 64 and let it rip? Well, here's another Nintendo 64 controller. So there are a couple of unique aspects of this controller. Probably the only important one, though, are these C buttons. See, these are 4 directional C buttons that can also double as face buttons. If you look at a modern controller design, and pretty much every modern controller looks somewhat like this, there are only 4 face buttons, not 6, and you have a right analog stick, but it's not really a suitable replacement for a button. A button you press, you can unpress, you can press 2 buttons at once. An analog stick isn't quite like that. And especially if the controller doesn't have a gate on it, you're not going to get the same haptic feedback. So if I were to map this to, say, C right, and I accidentally went down right, it wouldn't necessarily be clear to my hands. So you're not going to be able to get a perfect experience if you try to translate it that way. Enter the Brawler64. This is a Nintendo 64 controller made by Retro Fighters. It takes some modern controller design philosophy, but makes a Nintendo 64 controller using it. And so you don't have a right analog stick, you have 4 face buttons, which is good. But then you also have an analog stick that uses the much improved modern design. And in addition, you have 4 shoulder buttons. We'll get into that in a second. Now, if it wasn't obvious, I have a Nintendo 64. I do play it occasionally, and I've used this controller a lot. And for a lot of games, it's just a straight-up improvement over the original Nintendo 64 controller. But there are 2 very subtle things that I have to complain about. One, these triggers. For some godforsaken reason, they decided to make the Z button 2 triggers on the back. It's not the fact that there are 2 of them that I'm going to complain about. It's the fact that they're triggers. So they don't press down like a button does, they gradually go down through a range of motion before they're considered depressed fully. Why would you do this? The Z button on the Nintendo 64 controller is a digital button. You have it pressed, you have it unpressed. There's no pressure sensitivity, there's no range of having pressed it. And this is just straight up a downgrade over the original Z button. In some games, for example, Star Fox, where you might want to press Z twice quickly, it's not as easy to do using this trigger as it would be with a button. And then the other problem I had with this controller, and it's not really a problem with the controller, but it is a aspect where I think it is inferior to the original. One very underspoken thing about the Nintendo 64 controller is that the D-pad is actually like really good. It's probably the best D-pad Nintendo has made, which I know sounds like a wild claim, but like thinking about it, the NES controller, that was the first iteration. The Super Nintendo, pretty good. But this D-pad is like perfect. I mean, it's firm, yet just squishy enough. I mean, there are only a couple of Nintendo 64 games that do use the D-pad, but they do exist, and while playing those games, I will actually just plug in the original Nintendo 64 controller instead of using this, because this D-pad, in addition to being slightly harder to reach with the thumbs, it's a little bit off feeling. It's a little too squishy and too resistive. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but it's not the same as the original D-pad. The original Nintendo 64 D-pad is fantastic. And so, unfortunately, while the Brawler 64 is great, works perfectly fine for most games, probably. I'm, I guess, a little weirdo. I have complaints with it. And so, at this point, you're probably saying, well, okay, if you were to just get a new Nintendo 64 controller without a worn analog stick, like, surely there are people out there making that, right? Like, just a regular layout Nintendo 64 controller with an analog stick that does not get worn as easily. So apparently that is not as easy as you might think. Here is a Nintendo 64 controller. However, a little subtlety here. If you look at the top of the controller, you can see it's made by Nintendo. And this one is made by The Void. So this is not an official Nintendo 64 controller. This is a cheap bootleg I bought at a flea market for $20. Because it's new, and I don't know if it'll stay like this, but the analog stick does snap right back into place. And, you know, it's a lighter resistance than the original Nintendo ones. And so, you might be thinking, hey, problem solved. First problem with this controller, and this might just be because it's a cheap one, but it feels really cheap. Like, the plastic is really, I don't know, leaving a lot to be desired. It kind of feels like a toy. It just doesn't feel right overall. And then the other problem is that this, while it appears to be perfectly fine, actually isn't. It turns out that it's actually really not a trivial task to recreate an original Nintendo 64 analog stick. And to explain that, let's talk about dead zones real quick. All right, so if we boot up Perfect Dark here, you can see that as I move the control stick, you know, yay amount, I move yay amount in the game. You know, this is how I'm looking around. So take note of how fast the camera's moving as I push the stick all the way. We'll do a couple circles here. You know, this is a normal gameplay experience. Now let's do the exact same thing except using the flea market controller. Notice how it goes like absolutely all over the place for no reason at all. I am not even pushing the control stick that hard, it's just going haywire. So let's investigate exactly why this is happening. So what you're looking at right now is a tool made for simply testing Nintendo 64 controllers. In other words, this is the objectively greatest Nintendo 64 game. And what we're going to do, there are a lot of displays you could choose here, but we're going to look at the live input display. And that green octagon is what they expect in normal factory produced Nintendo 64 controller by Nintendo uh, to have input when you just go as far as you can on the control stick. As you can see, I am not quite reaching that boundary, and that's because of how worn this control stick is. But actually on the bottom, I seem to almost be passing it. And so, you know, that's another thing, you know, it could just misalign over time. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go back, and we're going to compare the flea market controller. All right, and let's let her rip. Hopefully you're seeing the problem here. Yeah, so the dead zones go way outside of where they're supposed to. You look, this octagon is at about 85, I believe, in each direction. And then it's like 70 X and Y on the diagonals. But it's just a square of 110s along the outside here. Like, this is definitely not normal Nintendo 64 controller behavior. And, you know, it makes sense. If you go to Perfect Dark and use this controller, the camera goes so haywire because the game isn't expecting a controller that's capable of having that amount of X and Y analog input. So to summarize, I'm on a journey to get a Nintendo 64 controller that has the original layout, but has an analog stick that doesn't suck. And as much as I love the idea of Steel Stick 64, it looks like they're on track to manufacture about 100 of those by the year 2036, and I don't know if I want to wait that long. So I found a product online. It is a replacement joystick for the N64 controller. Now, the Amazon listing said Nintendo 64 replacement joystick GameCube style. And I was wondering, like, what on earth do they mean by GameCube style? Like, I'm assuming it has a more modern analog stick design, but why GameCube style specifically? Looking at the box, it does say short stick style. I don't know if you can see that or if it's out of focus, but I guess that's what they mean. We're gonna test this thing out. We're gonna see if we can create an ideal controller. You may be saying, but with the trouble I just mentioned about joysticks, how can I guarantee like that doesn't fall into the same trap? So I looked into the reviews for this product, and it turns out that people were complaining about the very same dead zone issue, that the dead zones were completely off, and apparently they fixed it. So we're gonna put that to the test, first and foremost. Now, just as aids for additional testing, I yet another Nintendo 64 controller. This is an actual Nintendo one. And one more thing. I have a box. In this box, believe it or not, 2 more off-brand Nintendo 64 controllers. So we're going to go into the Nintendo 64 controller testing app that I showed earlier, and we're going to test all of these. We're going to test the 3 original Nintendo 64 controllers by Nintendo. We're going to check the Brawler 64. We're going to check the 3 off-brand ones, see how they all do, and then I'm going to install that replacement stick in one of the original Nintendo ones and see how it performs. So without further ado, here are the comparisons. So basically, how's this going to work? We're currently using the see-through purple Nintendo 64 controller they started off the video with. We're going to do a 5-sample test. Now on the first 3 samples, I'm just going to go like a natural stick position And then on the next two, I'm going to push down on the control stick as hard as I possibly can. And that way, you know, we're just going to get the median, and I think it'll show the full range that we get. All right, so as you can see, you know, as I said earlier, this controller is a little bit more down heavy. You can see the up and up right and up left are not as high as the down, down right, and down left. The left and right are pretty even. I guess the left is a bit more sensitive, but not by much. We get an interesting looking trapezoidal shape almost with our results here. That blue shape is the median. For comparison, I think we could show it. Here's the ideal. So we're nowhere close to the green on the top, and then on the bottom, we're still a bit short of it for the most part. The bottom left seems to be, you know, about sensitive enough, but it seems a little imprecise almost too. So there's that. If you're curious, here are the HoriPad mini dead zones. As you can see, they're a bit wider than the original Nintendo 64 controller ones. All right, so let's move on to the first gray controller. All right, so this gray one, actually pretty similar results. We can see the bottom left was the best match for the ideal there. And it is a bit easier to go down than up, according to this. You can see in the up left, there was one, you know, pretty bad measurement that was like really short of where it was supposed to be. And if you look at the bottom left, you can see that there were a couple measurements that were outside of the intended range. But overall, pretty similar. We get a more octagonal shape than we did before, but still not as it should be. All right, so this was the second gray controller, and this is looking pretty good, actually. Still, the downward direction prevails as the most sensitive, so I don't know if that's just like a general thing. Maybe it's possible that a lot of games involve pushing up a lot, and so that wears down more easily over time, whereas the down kind of stays a little less worn. But weakness in the upper right especially, but even the upper left is pretty close to where it's supposed to be. So this is a pretty good control stick. Now let's move on to the fun ones. These are going to be the off-brand ones, and starting with the flea market one. All right, so as you can see, the results are exactly what you would have expected. It's a complete square around the outside. Just as a fun little visual, here's what it's supposed to look like. It does not even come close. Even the wider dead zones of the HoriPad Mini, they pale in comparison to the giant square that is this controller's dead zones. I should also mention that during this test, some of my A button presses weren't even registering, so I think overall this is just like not a good controller. All right, it's time to test the off-brand Nintendo 64 controllers, and I'm going to unbox this thing. Do not question why I'm using kitchen scissors to do this. All right, good, and all right, so these, just like the one I got from the flea market, are a Void brand. And, ooh, this is interesting. So, let's just take this flea market one for comparison. You look very closely at the control stick. You can see there's like a little ball at the back with like holes on the side. It's out of focus, but hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about if you have one of your own controllers. All the Nintendo 64 controllers have those. For some reason, this controller, though, it's just like a flat panel. Now, it does seem like... It seems more rubbery than the flea market one, and it bounces back really nice. And it feels less cheap. Actually, I would like use this for 2D games, even if the analog stick sucked. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. Let's see how it does in the comparison. Oh my god, guys. those off-brand Nintendo 64 controllers came with 2 additional analog stick pieces. It looks like only the top part of the analog stick, so apparently this might pop off at some point. That's concerning. So now we're going to try the 2 controllers that I ordered online. Here is number 1. One additional note about the flea market controller, it's really hard to unplug from the system. I don't know if that's just it being new or if that's like a problem with the controller itself. I guess these other new controllers would help us determine that. All right, so interesting results here. I will say during the test, I noticed something that I didn't notice about this controller before. Let's switch back to recording here. So here's the controller. As you can see, the gate around the analog stick is a much more regular octagon than you would find in a genuine Nintendo 64 controller. This as a comparison, should bring up one of the originals so we're not comparing to some bootleg. The octagon is like, the diagonals are out more, whereas this is very regular, and it actually kind of resembles the gate around this Brawler in some sense. I think the Hori mini pad has a similar gate, and while doing the test, I noticed that the analog stick was so like a combination of the me not being used to the gates and it being bouncy. I couldn't even hit the right direction. Like it was saying bottom right, and I was like, "Am I bottom right?" It almost feels like a round gate. And so if we look at the results here, so the different shape that you see here is partially a result of the different gate that is on the controller. And if you look, it is, not ideal. It's wider than the original OEM controllers, but not that much wider than the Hori pad. It actually matches pretty closely. And so, that makes sense. It has an octagonal gate, just like the Hori pad mini. I think this is not a bad controller, believe it or not. I didn't have any problems with the A button being responsive either. And yeah, you get different dead zones than you would on an original Nintendo 64 controller, and so, there are probably some games that aren't really designed around that. But if it's a game that you would use a HoriPad Mini on and be okay with, then you might be able to, use this just fine. Because you don't get the monolithic square that you get with the flea market controller. That's that's the key here. You don't want that square. One additional thing to note, the flea market controller being hard to unplug was just that controller. This controller was very easy to unplug, and so that flea market controller is complete junk in almost every conceivable way. Complete waste of money. But these controllers are bought online, not too bad. And then we're going to test the second one. If there's a big difference in the shape, it is probably due to user error, just a forewarning. But let's see. All right, and so here are our results. And here's the mini pad. So this one, it looks like the lower right went a lot farther on all of the data points, and the lower left as well. In fact, it seems like the downward direction is a little bit more sensitive than it should be. So this is not as good as the other controller I bought online that came in the same box. But, there might be some user testing inconsistencies, and so I'm not going to hold that against this controller too much. The top looks very good, about in line with the HoriPad Mini. Obviously it's still outside of the OEM original dead zones, but this is not a bad fit whatsoever. I would, use this for, second player for sure. And of course, how could we forget the Brawler64? Let's bring that out and test it. All right, very interesting stuff. I will say, the gate experience, like the experience of pushing the analog stick against the gate, is the best out of any of the controllers that I just tested. And that's to be expected, you know, it's an actual modern control stick design. But these results are not quite what I was expecting. I was thinking it was going to be almost perfect, but you can see the top of the octagon is a little higher up than I would have figured. If we look at the OEM ideal, yeah, so the left and down positions actually seem pretty close to that, but the up and the right are farther. By the way, you can see that all of the measurements were exactly consistent because the control stick was in the exact same place. And yeah, the left and the down are lacking compared to the HoriPad Mini. The right matches, and the up actually exceeds the HoriPad Mini ideal. And so, you know, unusual shape on this one. I think the right being more sensitive than the left is actually pretty disappointing to find out because I played racing games with this and this might have screwed me over at some point. I just didn't realize it. The up and down, doesn't tend to matter as much, but it's still not where it should be. Still, using this controller is, very pleasant. I didn't notice any, extra sensitivity in any direction while playing any games that I was playing with it. But now knowing this, I'm a bit wary to use this controller anymore, to be honest. All right, well, that was a blast, wasn't it? Now, let's get into the meat and potatoes here. And I'm going to go into my garage and crack open one of the Nintendo 64 controllers. I think I'm going to go with the purple see-through one because it looks like that has the worst dead zones out of any of the Nintendo ones. We're going to replace it with the new stick, and we're going to see what happens. All right, and I was expecting the results to be very consistent. So the stick rubs very consistently against the gate as I'm doing this. You can see there's only one measurement that was like a little different from the rest. And the numbers I'm getting are pretty great, I think. Let's look. Yeah, there's the ideal Nintendo 64 OEM dead zones. We're right on the money. This is very, very good. You can see, it's smaller than the Hori mini pad, but it's right in line with an OEM Nintendo 64 controller. And, just using it right there, very snaps back into place real easily. The neutral is, one location. The stick's not wobbling around. If this doesn't degrade over, years and years of gaming, then I think we've done it. I think we've made the ideal Nintendo 64 controller. So I'm very, very pleased with these results. I would give this product a very good rating. It did exactly what I wanted it to. And now I can enjoy Nintendo 64 games without my tendons crying out in pain. But just real quick, now, of course, a tool's only gonna do so much. Let's see how it actually feels while playing a game. All right, let's long jump around here. Doing side flips, very, very easy. Mario's moving at the intended speed no matter what direction I'm inputting. Yeah, this is definitely how the game was meant to be played. And, hopefully this lasts. If, a year goes by and I've been using this and the stick gets worn out or the dead zones start to become inaccurate, I'll definitely make an update video, but it's looking great right now. Let's see. Can we do the fabled forward side flip? Yes, we can. Just like that. And my hands don't feel like they're about to burst from my body, so that's always good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of our journey. Overall, I would say good product. Um, again, very small sample size. I've only played with it for a couple minutes, but the couple minutes I have, it's a dream. The numbers don't lie. The dead zones are dead on. No pun intended. I think, personally, I might get more of these and replace all the control sticks in my remaining Nintendo 64 controllers with these. I mean, why use an inferior stick for no reason? And I'm getting the benefits of the regular Nintendo 64 controller layout, a button for a Z button instead of a trigger, a D-pad that's actually pretty solid. Yeah, I'm very happy with this. So that's gonna be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new about controllers, or I made you think about controller design a little bit more. I don't know. And stay tuned for more. Thank you and take care.